So, what most people don't realize about the 1804 Lewis and Clark expedition is that this was the first well-documented encounter that explorers ever had with grizzly bears. There were other explorers who had seen them, but what they wrote about those sightings were basically completely unknown to the general public and the scientific community. In 1691, fur trapper Henry Kelsey's encounter with the grizzly, as well as everything he documented about the American interior, was intentionally locked in a vault and hidden by the Hudson's Bay Company until 1928. And don't even get me started on the Hudson Bay Company. That's definitely going to be the subject of a video in the future. The Spanish also encountered grizzlies in California in 1769, but it was treated as classified military log information and was never distributed for public reading. The logs were secured in Mexico City in Spain and were never translated into English until the modern day, meaning that when Lewis and Clark headed off on their expedition to chart the unexplored western frontier, they were completely unaware of the existence of the continent's most ferocious predator. My name's Luke, I'm an American explorer and an anthropologist, and I come from a lineage of explorers who searched the American Southwest for lost Spanish treasure and ancient artifacts dating back to the 1890s. And this is American Wilds. So the Lewis and Clark expedition, which was commissioned by President Thomas Jefferson, was the very first expedition to cross overland from the Atlantic coast of North America all the way to the Pacific coast. The purpose of the expedition was to document the terrain of the newly acquired western frontier, find a passage by water from coast to coast, if such a thing actually existed, that could be used for commerce, and to secure the American presence in the Pacific Northwest before other European powers could take hold in that region. Jefferson instructed Lewis and Clark to meticulously observe and record the natural world of the uncharted western frontier, which meant terrain, resources, people, plants, and animals. Jefferson also strongly believed that woolly mammoths, whose remains had already been discovered buried in plantation fields in South Carolina, must have still existed somewhere out in the far corners of the western frontier. But rather than finding a woolly mammoth, the expedition would find a different kind of beast: the North American grizzly. Early in the journey, after finding a set of enormous bear tracks in the ground in North Dakota, the expedition was warned by the natives that there existed further west a massive beast that the natives treated with the same respect as an enemy nation. And as Meriwether Lewis wrote in 1805, the Indians give a very formidable account of the strength and ferocity of this animal, which they never dare to attack but in parties of 6, 8, or 10 persons, and are even then frequently defeated with the loss of one or more of their party. And in preparation to kill or hunt one of these beasts, he writes, they paint themselves and perform all those superstitious rites commonly observed when they are about to make war upon a neighboring nation. But the expedition highly doubted how fierce these bears actually could be, and they just thought that the natives were probably inept compared to their European rifles, or that the natives were just exaggerating for some reason. Keep in mind, white men were very familiar with bears on the East Coast, but black bears are easy to scare off and easy to kill. But just a couple weeks later, the expedition would finally encounter its first grizzly. They were now passing into what we call Montana today, an open sea of endless grassy plains, small hills, and bluffs, saying that not a single tree was anywhere in sight. While following along the banks of the Missouri River, they encountered the first two grizzlies. The expedition fired their rifles upon the bears, injuring both of them. One of the bears escaped into the brush, and the other ran straight toward Lewis himself. He turned and ran some 80 yards until the bear's injuries wore it down, and the riflemen shot it again, finally killing it. Now they were able to get a close look at this animal the natives had been constantly warning them of. Lewis determined it must have been a young male, not fully grown and weighing some 300 pounds. He writes, the legs of this bear are somewhat longer than those of the black, as are its talons and tusks incomparably larger and longer. It is a much more furious and formidable animal and will frequently pursue the hunter when wounded. It is astonishing to see the wounds they will bear before they can be put to death. The Indians may well fear this animal, equipped as they are generally with their bows and arrows or indifferent fusees. But in the hands of skillful riflemen, they are by no means as formidable and dangerous as they have been represented. And oh, how wrong he would be. Following this first encounter, Lewis and the crew were pretty confident that in the future, with an accurate shot from the rifleman, these grizzlies didn't stand much more of a threat to the expedition than a black bear. But less than a week later, the entire expedition's confidence in facing down these bears would start to crumble. On May 5th, right where the Poplar and Missouri rivers meet, the party would encounter an enormous male grizzly sitting out in the open plain. They quickly moved to a tactical position, and the rifleman unloaded a barrage of 10 shots into the beast. The bear let out a terrible roar and ran off, dying some 20 minutes later. Lewis writes, Captain Clark and Drewer killed the largest brown bear this evening, which we have yet seen. It was a most tremendous looking animal and extremely hard to kill, notwithstanding he had 5 balls through his lungs and 5 others in various parts. He swam more than half the distance across the river to a sandbar, and it was at least 20 minutes before he died. He did not attempt to attack, but fled and made the most tremendous roaring from the moment he was shot. We had no means of weighing this monster. Captain Clark thought he would weigh 500 pounds. For my own part, I think the estimate too small by 100 pounds. He inspected the bear and determined that it was likely well over 600 pounds. A few inches shy of being 9 feet long, standing an inch shy of 6 feet tall. Again, he noted that it was actually quite different from the black bear of the East Coast. Its claws were significantly longer and finer, making them much sharper than the black bear. Its lungs, liver, and heart were much larger in proportions as compared to the black bear. And he says that the grizzly's heart is like that of a large ox. And he finally notes that the mouth and jaw of the grizzly are likely 10 times the size of that of the black bear. Over the next week, grizzly sightings and encounters were becoming more and more frequent. The land was filled with buffalo, deer, and wolves as well. Little by little, the size and the ferocity of these bears was beginning to wear away at the confidence they had in handling these beasts. We saw a brown grizzly bear swim in the river above us. He disappeared before we could get in reach of him. I find that the curiosity of our party pretty well satisfied with respect to this animal. The formidable appearance of the male bear killed on the 5th, added to the difficulty with which they die even when shot through the vital parts, has staggered the resolution of several of them. Others, however, seem keen for action with the bear. I expect these gentlemen, as Lewis will call the bears, will give us some amusement shortly, as they, meaning the bears, soon begin to now copulate. On May 11th, a young private named William Bratton was scouting the area ahead of the expedition party. He was sneaking through the dense thicket and came upon another grizzly. He must have felt that he wouldn't be able to backtrack, putting distance between them, so he raised his rifle and sent a round through the bear's midsection. The grizzly instantly turned and charged. Bratton turned and ran some half a mile at a life or death sprint. Yelling for help to the party waiting back at camp, everyone rose to their feet and grabbed their guns, only to find that the injured bear had stopped following at some point during the chase. They tracked the blood trail for over a mile and found the grizzly digging a giant hole into the ground to protect itself, or so they thought. They shot another 10 rounds into the beast before it let out a massive roar and began furiously digging until it stopped moving completely. It was this experience, seeing such a massive creature shot more than 10 times, still with the ability to run miles and let out such a monstrous roar and dig a deep hole for itself to recover in. Lewis finally records that he and his men are beginning to fear what these animals could be capable of. He writes, "These bear being so hard to die rather intimidates us all. I must confess I do not like the gentleman and had rather fight 2 Indians than 1 bear. There is no other chance to conquer them by a single shot but by shooting them through the brains, and this becomes difficult in consequence of 2 large muscles which cover the sides of the forehead and the sharp projection of the center of the frontal bone, which is also of pretty good thickness." Just 3 days later, on May 14th, the expedition would have another hair-raising encounter. 6 of the men approached a lone grizzly out in the open ground. They used a bit of brush to hide as they got closer. 4 of the hunters shot at the bear, while 2 others would wait to fire their shot if needed. All 4 rifles ripped through the bear, 2 shots hitting each of the bear's lungs. But for now, the cracking rifles only showed the bear where the pain had come from. The beast turned and charged directly towards them. The other 2 riflemen unloaded their rifles, each hitting the bear, 1 shot grazing it and the other shattering its shoulder, but it didn't matter. The grizzly then charged the men with an open mouth as they ran at a dead sprint. One of the men crashed into the river with the grizzly just a few feet behind him before another member of the expedition sent a round through the bear's skull, which they were beginning to learn was the only way to stop this animal in its tracks. Over the next several weeks, the expedition would have several more encounters and close calls with large grizzlies along the river as they began to leave behind the wide open fields and small hills of eastern Montana and descended into the upper Missouri breaks of central Montana, where the terrain became increasingly narrow with tight canyon slots and dense brushlands right up to the river's edge, which meant that spotting a 9-foot-long, 6-foot-tall grizzly from a distance would become nearly impossible, and it would now be pretty easy to accidentally come upon a grizzly at point-blank range. On Friday, June 14th, Lewis was out hunting upon the flatter plains that sit above the tight terrain that lines the riversides. He shot a young buffalo, and as he was watching the animal bleed out, ready to collapse at any moment, he heard something large moving through the brush behind him. He turned around to realize that a grizzly had snuck up on him and was now within 20 feet. He had forgotten to reload his rifle after shooting the young buffalo, and with there being no place to hide himself or buy time, he had no choice but to make a run some 100 yards out to the river. As he ran for his life, he could hear the huffing and thudding of the monster of an animal closing the distance behind him. His only instinct was to jump into the river and position himself at such an angle that the bear would have to swim to reach him, and from there he would use his large spear-pointed pike to fend off the bear. When he dived into the river and took his position, the bear immediately halted itself at the water's edge, and for some reason that shocked Lewis, turned and ran off into the brush. So these grizzly bears were turning out to be a much bigger problem than Lewis and Clark and the rest of the expedition had originally intended, thinking that the natives must have just been inept compared to their rifles or that they were exaggerating. By the end of June, after one of the men was chased and nearly mauled to death by 3 grizzlies, the expedition had made rules that no man should ever walk alone outside of camp at any time of day for any reason whatsoever. They'd seen a bear that was as large as a bull and been attacked by another bear, but they had already climbed up into a tree and shot the bear in the head. When they came down to inspect the kill, they found this bear had front paws 9 inches across and back paws 11 inches across, with each claw 7 inches long. And returning to camp was no safer. All through the night, the dog that had been brought on the expedition was up all night barking and barking, and Lewis felt that this dog was likely the only thing keeping at bay the grizzlies who were hiding in the dark brush from ripping through their tents and dragging at least some of the men off into the woods that night. The next morning, Lewis wrote, "The white bear, which is the term that the natives gave when referring to grizzlies, have become so troublesome to us that I do not think it prudent to send one man alone on an errand of any kind, particularly where he has to pass through the brush. We have seen 2 of them on the large island opposite to us today. They come close around our camp, but have never yet ventured to attack us, and our dog gives us timely notice of their visits. He keeps constantly patrolling all night. I have made the men sleep with their arms by them as usual for fear of accidents." After another sleepless night of being trapped in their tents with the dog barking and bears prowling somewhere off in the darkness around the camp, the men decided to finally wage a war upon the grizzlies. The next day, they would cross the river to the island where the bears bed down and either kill them or drive them away to never haunt the camp again. The next morning, after an early shower of rain which brought an unusual amount of mosquitoes upon the camp, Lewis, Clark, and 12 of the men took their canoes across the short distance to the island that the bears had come from. The brush on the island was perfect for these massive bears to hide down in, thick and hardly penetrable. After a search, they found a bear which immediately charged one of the men. Within just 20 feet of being mauled, his rifle cracked off a round straight through the heart of the beast, which collided with the brush floor, giving the man a moment to get out of sight and reload his rifle. The bear climbed back to its feet and hurled itself through the thicket some 100 yards. The men followed the blood trail to find the bear lying dead. They measured him about a 400-pound young male, and after searching every other part of the island, they found no other bears and decided to head back to camp, yet again narrowly escaping being mauled to death by the deadliest animal in North America, which, I might add, they had no idea even existed at the start of this expedition. By the end of the expedition, at least 43 grizzlies were confirmed to be killed by the party, and an unknown number of grizzlies were wounded and never tracked down for fear that tracking them down might end up in the men being mauled themselves, with many more encounters and sightings along the way. Some estimates are around 103 encounters in total. Almost all of the grizzly encounters happened in the region now known as Montana, which is still a primary domain of these gentlemen, as Lewis called them. Now, in the modern day, historians, archaeologists, and wildlife biologists have been able to almost perfectly retrace the steps of the expedition, with also the help of all of the logs that were taken throughout the course of the journey. Now, biologists tend to think that the ferocity of the behavior of the bears of this expedition probably boils down to the fact that the expedition traveled through narrow wildlife corridors where prey and predators met around the main water source, and the men of the expedition were coincidentally competing with the grizzlies in their own killing fields. So the attacks that the men sustained were not only defensive from being surprised, but also territorial. Furthermore, since the Ice Age ended some 12,000 years ago, those bears had been the undisputed apex predators of the Northwest. They had absolutely no fear instinct. It's only with the modern day and our modern day technology, which was really introduced into the region in that 1804 to 1806 expedition, and those rifles that the men brought along with them, from then till now, that grizzlies have mostly started to learn to stay away from people. It's estimated that somewhere north of 50,000 grizzlies roam the vast western frontier from the Pacific Ocean across the Great Plains and actually all the way down into Mexico just 100 to 200 years ago. But because of trapping and trophy hunting, by 1975, there were less than 1,000 grizzlies, and they could only be found within 1 to 2% of their historic range. And today, there are only somewhere around 1,900 living wild in the lower 48 states. Every year, around 1 to 3 people are killed and another 30 to 40 are attacked each year in the US as a result of grizzly attacks. Their territories and range are slowly expanding every year, and they're also widely known to have vastly different personalities, making each encounter pretty unpredictable and potentially extremely dangerous. So in primeval times, ancient people didn't look at creatures and beasts like the grizzly bear or lions or tigers or leopards as just some beast or pest that was living distant off in the forest. They respected them as something like a rival tribe, and if they weren't careful, humans could be outsmarted, outfought, or even hunted by these animals. Grizzlies and big cats are the primeval equal to humanity, and I think that's why we're so fascinated by them even till today. I'm Luke. Like and subscribe for more history from the American wilds, and I'll see you next time.